Okay, for this final lecture of Module 2, we're going to look at, or I'm going to look at, and you're going to look at me looking at it, we're going to look at outside influences on the legislative process. In the previous lecture, it looked at caucuses, committees, and party leadership, the people who actually are in Congress, who have an influence over other members of Congress and over the flow of the legislative process. Obviously, everything that happens in Congress happens through the 535 members of Congress. The way that those 535 people behave is obviously subject to a lot of different influences. And I've mentioned this before, but I'll kind of talk about it again. One big influence that I think is discounted an awful lot is, by people who pay attention to politics, is the conscience of the legislator, like what they think is right and wrong, why they got into politics in the first place, why they are spending their time doing this job that for most of us pays pretty well and certainly has a lot of perks, but ultimately really is, compared to private sector work of equivalent power and influence, is really not a great job. And it's very frustrating, and it takes you far from home, and you have to get reelected in the House of Representatives every 2 years, and so you're constantly having to fundraise and pay attention to your constituents and your base and look not to get primaried. There's a lot of crap that goes along with being a member of Congress, and people go into it and stay in it because they have a conscience, a political conscience. They have what they think is ideas that will help solve the problems that the country faces, that their constituents face, make the world a better place. That's one of the influences. Other influences are the kinds of things that they have to think about as they go about their job of, one, being a legislator, right? Doing the actual job of governance, and two, getting reelected. You can't do anything in Congress unless you get reelected over and over again. Now, in the Senate, you don't need to get elected over and over and over and over and again. You know, if you get elected and then reelected twice, you've been in the Senate for 18 years, and that's a relatively typical span of time for a member of the Senate. You can do a lot in 18 years. You can do a lot in 12 years. First-term senators can do something because 6 years is a decent amount of time. It's 3 election cycles. It's 3 House races. But still, as a freshman senator, you're not going to have as much influence as you'll have in your second, third, and if you make it to a 4th and 5th term. Members of the House for sure have to get reelected time and time again before they're even going to get on to a committee that they want to be on, before they're ever going to have a hope to be part of the leadership team or have a voice with the leadership team, be part of an influential, or have a strong voice in an influential caucus. This is one of the things that members of Congress, especially in the House, can often find frustrating, is that they get elected and they're like, I'm going to go do things. And this is particularly true for people who have come to Congress with the aid of outside money, who are essentially not establishment politicians. They think that I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to make a difference, right? Or I'm going to shake things up. I'm going to change the way Congress does business. And they find that they can create trouble, they can obstruct, they can make difficulties for party leaders and for important caucuses, and this is one of the things that outsiders often do. But to get something done takes patience, time, and in order to have that time, you need to get reelected. So one of the biggest influences over the behavior of legislators is their reelection prospects. And I just want to point to the notes here. I have all the notes on the board. Underneath here in a kind of a chalky, wavy thing, outline is reelection, right? Reelection prospects and the factors that make it easier to get reelected, not just likely to get reelected, but easier. In other words, that you have to spend less time on this essentially obnoxious task of, 1, raising a lot of money, 2, making sure that you don't piss off your constituents, 3, lining up the winning coalition time and time again. It's extremely tiresome. It's extremely obnoxious. It is the least favorite thing that elected officials do is get reelected. Now, some people like it, some people are good at it, it's fun for some people, and there's the excitement of a campaign and the energy, but ultimately it is obnoxious, difficult, potentially very time-consuming. One of the reasons why outside groups have such a strong influence over legislators is because they can help with this extremely obnoxious task. they can make it easier, less time consuming, less stressful, less worrisome, more certain that a member of Congress is going to get reelected. And the reelection is what they need in order to be able to get something done. So people who help you do the obnoxious thing that you need to do in order to be able to accomplish what you set out to accomplish by becoming a member of Congress in the first place, you're going to be happy to connect with those people. You're not necessarily going to just do their bidding, right? You're not going to just be like, oh great, you got me a bunch of money to help me get reelected, and you got me some endorsements, and you got me some good publicity that helped raise my profile and make people pleased with me. So what do you want, right? This is a quid pro quo. That's not the way it works. Now again, for some people maybe it does. Some people are like, look, I'll be your puppet, I'll be your toy, I'll be your tool here. Tell me what you want and I will give it to you as long as you keep giving me the things I need to get reelected. Of course there are some people like that, but that's not the dominant model. The dominant model is somebody who goes into politics and puts up with all of the crap of it and does so for years and years, puts stress on their family, travels to DC, all of this stuff. They do it because they want to make a difference. And to make a difference means that you sometimes have to negotiate with your conscience, you have to negotiate with your supporters, your backers, either internally or actually externally, so that you can give as little as possible to get the most of what you want. This is the dance that happens between legislators and outside influences, which is, I'm a legislator, I want to give you outside influences as little as possible and get as much in return as possible. But of course, outside groups want to get as much as possible from legislators while giving as little of their resources as they can, because everybody has scarce resources and wants to spread them around as much as possible. So this is the sort of underlying psychological and structural dynamic that gives outside groups any influence at all, but also keeps outside groups from basically just being like, well, the most powerful ones, the richest ones, can just push a button and get the policy outcomes that they want. Some groups win more often than others, but no group wins all the time. Nobody gets exactly what they want. There's not a like pushing the briefcase of money across the desk and getting the yes votes and the no votes that you want. That is a caricature of how things happen, and it's actually, I think, a kind of a misleading caricature. Now, one of the things that I explore in depth in the interest groups class, and there are a couple of optional videos that I would highly recommend from that interest groups class that talk about what translates interest group interests into policy victories. What are the factors, right? Typically people think that corporations and big moneyed interests and wealthy individuals get what they want and everybody else gets screwed over. That's not 100% true, though it's not entirely not true either, but there are a number of different factors that translate into interest group success. And I do want to talk about interest groups today and what they bring to the political world that enables them to have influence. And so you'll be able to map, like, okay, which groups have a lot of this and are able to translate it into more political success, and which groups have less of this and therefore they struggle more. When interest groups can bring something to a group, especially a group of legislators, not just one, because one vote is relatively useless in Congress, but to a group of legislators, then they're going to have a greater likelihood of getting more of what they want rather than less. So when we talk about winners and losers in the legislative process, nobody is ever going to win all the time. The Chamber of Commerce, the NRA, Grover Nordquist, Chase Manhattan, these are high-profile names of groups that win probably more often than others, but they don't always win. In fact, they lose sometimes, and their influence over Congress is not as direct as maybe people would like to think. Now, let me get into the specifics that are up here so I can get from sort of generalities into more the specific dynamics. How do interest groups get legislators to vote yes and no on the things they want them to vote yes and no on? How do they get legislators to introduce amendments that are beneficial to them, to kill amendments that they don't like, to craft legislation that looks better from the point of that interest group rather than worse? Well, there are a few mechanisms that are used. And I'll just point out that there are lobbyists over here and there's money, and of course interest groups are going to employ lobbyists, they're going to utilize money. So there are connections among these things, but interest groups are probably the biggest overall outside influence on the legislative process. And now when I say interest groups, there are two different categories of interest groups. There's formal interest groups that have an organization, a name, a mission statement, a website, a newsletter, specific dues-paying members, or maybe not dues-paying members, but people who contribute. Most of them are dues-paying members. And then there's informal interest groups, in other words, people who actually have an interest in common, who haven't organized something around it, don't have a name and a board and a newsletter and an email list. While both of those groups can have influence over the legislative process, it's really formal interest groups that have a name, a membership, a newsletter, the ability to endorse, the ability to mobilize members through various ways. They're the ones that really have an influence. And so that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about interest groups. The informal interest groups, the ones that are unorganized, will have an impact, because when you go to get reelected as an elected official, you're going to pay attention to the groups of voters that are going to be key to your victory, and informal interest groups may be among those particular groups of voters. But it's going to be the formal interest groups that are going to be foremost in the legislators' minds when they're actually in the legislature, rather than just messaging towards the persuadable voters and the voters who might or might not go to the polls at all. What do interest groups bring to the re-election prospects of a legislator that help them to get that legislator to listen to them, to get involved in that negotiation with their conscience? Now, first of all, sometimes an interest group has a legislator who sees things exactly the way they see them, and then basically their job is done at that point, though it's not 100% done, because there are still things that the interest group will provide to that legislator. Let's say that I'm a committed Second Amendment advocate who is against all forms of gun control. The NRA is, I'm gonna do what they want, because what I want and what they want is aligned. It's the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to still provide me with resources, but I'm not in need of being influenced. I'm already aligned. So let's think about legislators who are in that middle area, because if I'm unaligned with an interest group, if I'm a gun control advocate and I'm dedicated to that, and that's why I got into politics in the first place, or it's one of the key issues that I have, and I think that guns are a scourge in America, and we need to pass, at least at base, some common sense restrictions, if not stronger regulations, then the NRA is not going to move me at all anyway. And in fact, the NRA's opposition is probably something that I'm going to publicize, because my constituents, the people I'm trying to reach, are going to actually be pleased that I'm fighting the NRA rather than going along with the NRA. So those are the two cases where interest groups essentially have you either you're aligned with them or you're totally non-aligned with them. It's legislators who are somewhere in the middle, who could vote potentially for some kind of gun control regulations, but aren't going to vote for all of them, who aren't going to push for them, and who don't make it their important cause. And maybe somebody who doesn't think about gun control at all. They are people who actually need to be influenced, because if gun control regulation comes up in a committee they're on, or if they gets all the way to the chamber for a vote, the NRA is going to want to have some influence over a large number of those legislators, if not all of them. Of course, all of them would be ideal, but those swing legislators, right? So we have swing districts and safe districts, we have swing voters and base voters, we have moderate independent voters and base voters, and we also have essentially dyed-in-the-wool legislators and persuadable legislators. It's really the persuadable legislators, and some of these persuadable legislators may come from safe seats, and they are persuadable because they still have to maintain their party nomination. The safe seat for a Democrat or Republican is safe to the party, but not safe to a particular individual. There are persuadable legislators, and these are the people that organized interest groups, are going to go to work on. The constituent connection I have at number one, because it's very important, and two, because I think it's kind of the unsung factor in American politics. We hear about money, and about social media and media, and we think that, okay, those are the big influences over legislators. Can you help a legislator raise a lot of money? Can you get them good publicity through all kinds of media channels, both mainstream and social media? Yes, those are important influences, and I'll get to those. But the constituent connection is really important. If an interest group can present to a legislator a policy that is supported by and beneficial to members of that legislator's district, particularly if it's a large number, or particularly if it's an extremely influential or key group, then the legislator is going to be much more likely to listen to what that interest group wants. When you represent, as an interest group, the interests of constituents, then you're going to have a really large amount of influence, because what ultimately gets somebody reelected? It's not money, it's not publicity, it's not party connections, it's votes. Now, money, publicity, and party connections are going to be helpful to getting those votes, but they're not the only thing that gets you those votes. And there are other things that can get you votes that might be a more direct route. Imagine that an interest group says, look, we represent the timber industry, and the timber industry is really big in your district, and when you either vote for legislation that helps the timber industry with land, beneficial land use policy or subsidies or new projects or contracts, then you're helping the people in your district. And you're going to be able to tell them about that, and we're going to tell them about that too. So it's in our mutual interest for you to work in this direction on timber and land use and environmental policy. And legislators are going to be very much key to listening to those messages. Now, one of the things that I say that lobbyists can bring is the constituent connection. And another thing that lobbyists bring is information. And one of those forms of information is how does a certain policy benefit the constituents in that district, so that the legislator can then actually basically just cut and paste that information and pass it on to their constituents and to voters in the next election cycle. That's one of the things that lobbyists do. Lobbyists provide information that help legislators have an easier time communicating with their constituents what it is that they're doing for them and why it is that they should get reelected so that they can continue doing these good things. So obviously the words constituent connection are both here and here. Information, and I'll get to this in a couple minutes when I talk a little more specifically about what it is that lobbyists do on the ground, but some of that information backs up the constituent connection. This is really a big influence, because when you, as a legislator, look out at your district or your state, and you see groups of people who share either material or ideological interests, and there's an interest group, an organized interest group, that is also saying, okay, here's the policies that these people want, because we know, because they're our members, then you do it, right? Just do it. And that is a form of soft power, in a way, that interest groups have. It's soft because it doesn't require any real cajoling. It doesn't require the use of hardcore resources like money or endorsements. It's basically just like, do the right thing for your people, which is for yourself, which also happens to be for us. So this is when there is this kind of de facto or massageable alignment between what an interest group wants out of policy and what a legislator wants out of policy. That means that when that legislator goes back to get reelected, they can bring accomplishments with them. In the old days, and the old days are coming back actually now in terms of earmarks. In the old days, earmarks were one of the best ways that you could bring things home, literally bring the money home to your constituency in terms of projects, construction, research money, subsidies, specific targeted funding for the people who live in or work in your state or your district. And that was a really powerful way to build coalitions that actually crossed ideological and party lines, was by creating this kind of broader set of constituent connections by earmarking funding and government projects and contracts and development to particular districts. Interest groups can also make fundraising easier. And fundraising, of all of the re-election tasks, fundraising is the most obnoxious. It is the most persistent need. It is the thing that you cannot do without, as a person seeking re-election, and that is the most obnoxious, most difficult, most persistent of your tasks, then when an interest group can make fundraising easier for you by donating money to you, by making that interest group's members aware that you're a sympathetic legislator and they should spend their political contributions on your campaign, when an interest group can connect you up with people who are going to attend fundraisers or who are going to donate money to you, then you're going to look favorably on that group. It's like any favor, right? If you have a friend who always is going to give you a ride to the airport, you know they're always going to give you a ride to the airport, then you're much more likely to do things for that friend in return, because giving somebody a ride to the airport is a really great thing. And at least it was for most of my 20s and 30s, when it was like I flew a lot, or my friends flew a lot, we traveled a lot. We were very mobile people and didn't have cars, and the idea of getting a ride to the airport, especially like a 5 a.m. Ride for a 7 o'clock flight, somebody did that for you regularly, you're just like, you're great. You're helping me to do something which is obnoxious. Helping with fundraising is obviously many levels better than rides to the airport, but think about all the things that when friends are there for you or family members are there for you that take some obnoxious tasks off of your to-do list very easily, you're going to feel very connected to them, and you're going to be more likely to help them out, even if for whatever they need, even if it's something that you wouldn't necessarily be inclined to do. Let's say, for example, you have an unethical friend who's like, I'm trying for this job and I don't have any relevant experience, but I know I can do the job and I want to put some experience and a reference on my resume. Will you lie and tell, when they call you up and tell this person that you were my boss and they did a great job? This is the kind of thing that happens. It's actually an example I talk about in my ethics class, and it's unethical behavior, but people ask us to do unethical things all the time. If that person has always given you rides to the airport, if that person has always, dog sat for you, or helped, held back your hair while you puked and when you were too drunk, whatever it is that they were always there for, you're more likely to say yes to this request. If you ask, if you're going to be unethical in this way, you're going to ask somebody to lie for you as a reference for a resume, you better make sure that's a person that you've done a lot for, because otherwise it's ridiculous. You're already asking somebody to do something unethical. Interest groups are asking you to further legislation that benefits them, that you might not agree as strongly is going to benefit the world as the interest group wants, and if they have driven you to the airport, held back your hair while you were throwing up when you were too drunk, whatever it is that they've done for you, if they've helped you fundraise, then you are going to be more likely, not necessarily going to do it for sure, but you're going to be more likely to take that step in that particular direction. Now, publicity is an extremely important factor for getting reelected. Positive publicity. And publicity comes in a variety of forms, and interest groups will play in all of these arenas. Right? Endorsements are probably the biggest form of beneficial publicity for a candidate seeking election or re-election. Endorsements not only get your name into a circuit that has a lot of eyeballs looking, into a channel that has a lot of eyeballs looking at it, it provides those eyeballs with a reason to side with you over your opponent or your opponents. And endorsements tend to bring from high-profile influential newspapers, from important bloggers, from other opinion leaders, from organizations like labor unions and professional associations that people look to for political leadership. You get an endorsement from one of these formal channels, and you're going to get a lot of votes really quickly. Right? And you're going to get them for very little money, for very little monetary investment. So what you have to invest to get the endorsement is a policy nudge in a particular direction. Yes votes and amendments introduced or amendments killed, then you're likely to do that because endorsements are fantastic. That's a form of really, really inexpensive, fast-track publicity that translates into a lot of votes. Newsletters and email also. Formal interest groups have formal communications. They have an email list. They send out newsletters. They send out email blasts. They have lists of people's phone numbers. They send text blasts. Any of these different forms usually are going to be conduits for endorsements, right? But they're also going to be conduits for constituent connection, where you can get your name. You helped to make this thing happen that is beneficial to a lot of the people who are in your district and who will potentially vote for you because of this. Raising awareness of why it is that you're doing good work for the people who are going to either hire you again or who are going to fire you in favor of somebody else. Social media, of course, is another channel through which Publicity and organized interest groups have platform that you may or may not have, right? Interest groups have a lot of attention, especially the bigger ones, and they get the eyeballs of people who both are members, formal members, as well as people who are kind of followers of it. These social media platforms, as I don't even have to say too much on it because I think everybody knows, can be very influential in getting people to orient their politics in one direction or another, orient them towards voting for you or voting for one of your opponents. Scorecards are a big, important form of publicity and kind of a very insider baseball type of thing, and they are usually publicized through newsletters and email blasts and text blasts and social media platforms. A legislative scorecard is when a formal interest group, and not every interest group does this, but lots and lots of them do across the political spectrum, will have essentially a rubric for grading legislators' behaviors. There are other also kind of political observer groups that do this kind of thing, that have scores of liberalism and conservatism, scores of bipartisanship. There are various kinds of legislative scorecards that are generated by political scientists, by think tanks, by just political observers. Interest groups definitely use them, and the larger your interest group, the more members that interest group has in your district, the more influential the legislative scorecard is going to be. And you're going to, they're going to tout that, and you might yourself tout that, right? If you're a gun rights advocate and you have a high score from the NRA, that's good, right? That is going to help you fundraise. It's going to get a lot of votes for you. It's going to get some people to just vote for you automatically. Like, oh, you have a 93 from the NRA. Your opponent has a 23. I like what the NRA has to say about gun rights. I'm going to vote for you. I don't even have to be an NRA member. I can just look at that. And you can use that score in your own messaging materials to persuade voters. Interestingly, the legislative scorecards, you can make use of a low score as well as a high score depending on what that legislative scorecard is. There are some Democrats who take pride in their extremely low NRA score, right? There are some Republicans who take pride in their extremely low score on the ACLU and other civil liberties groups' scorecards for them. Because you say, well, look, if the ACLU hates me, I must be doing something right. If the NRA hates me, I must be doing something right. So it doesn't always have to be a positive score. Now, if you have a positive score, then you're going to not only be able to tout that yourself, but that interest group is also through their publicity channels, particularly through their newsletters and their social media channels, they're going to get behind you, right? The NRA can't, they can't stop you from using, as a Democrat and a gun control advocate, your low score, but they're not going to amplify that message for you. If you have a high score from somebody, they're going to not only make that score available to you, they're going to help you amplify that score as well. These are the things that interest groups can do. There are a couple of videos from the interest groups class linked in the recommended videos, the optional videos, and I would recommend watching them because I talk more about this stuff and give more detailed examples. Let's move over to lobbyists. Lobbyists are connected to interest groups in the sense that interest groups employ lobbyists. This is what they do. There are really very few kind of lone gunslinging lobbyists out there trying to influence the direction of public policy for what they think is right and wrong, right? There are some of those people, right? But usually those people actually, rather than being lobbyists, are going to go into advocacy in a different way. Are going to be social movement leaders. Are going to be trying to get nonprofits and other types of entities to influence legislators. But if you're a lobbyist, it means that you have one or more interest groups behind you asking you to officially register as a lobbyist and officially go to the Capitol building and congressional offices and restaurants in the DC area and golf courses and meet with and discuss policy issues with legislators. Now, I think the image of lobbyists is that they come with their big tote bag or their briefcase full of goodies, money of course, but also other perks, junkets, memberships, concert tickets, all this stuff, and they shovel that stuff over to the legislator, and the legislator says, oh, thank you very much, that's great, what do you want me to do, right? That's not how it works. One of the things that lobbyists need and get because of all of those perks, but because of their connection to an interest group that actually has fundraising connections as well as the rest, is it gets them access. Legislators are human beings with a 24-hour day, and really less than a 24-hour day in terms of how much time they can actually spend doing work. They can't hear from everybody. Members of the House of Representatives represent about 800 to 850,000 people. Members of the Senate represent, in some cases, millions of people. They can't listen to everybody. They can't hear every idea. They can't open their door and have a meeting with and have lunch with and play golf with every person or faction that wants to have a voice. So lobbyists are people who have a greater level. They have a disproportionate level of access. And this is where the lobbyist interest group connection is. You're going to take phone calls from, meet lobbyists, go golfing with, spend your Saturday golfing time with lobbyists that come from interest groups, represent interest groups that you have an affinity towards for one reason or another. Access is extremely important. It was often said about Donald Trump that he would basically just go with whatever the last person had said to him, and that whether that is or isn't true, that is broadly true for a lot of people who are in politics, that the final voice is the strongest. And certainly, whether it's the final voice or not, the voice or voices that have had the most access, the most airtime, are going to be the most influential, right? The person whose conscience, whose ideas, whose perspective I think about the most is my wife's. Because, of course, because we're in a committed relationship and a huge partnership and a family business and child rearing. But all that, of course, so we have, there's a constituent connection, to use the metaphor, but also I talk to her the most. I hear her voice in my head the most when she's not around, because I spend a hugely disproportionate amount of time talking to her. That translates over to legislators. They're going to hear the voice of lobbyists that they meet with the most. The more often you encounter a particular perspective, the more likely that perspective is to kind of sink in to your own perspective. This is why teachers are so influential on younger people, why parents can be influential, why peers are super influential. In fact, peers are really influential because you're hearing your peers' voices a lot more than you're hearing your parents' voices and your teachers' voices. Lobbyists can and want to get the kind of access that essentially helps the legislators leads the legislators to internalize that lobbyist's voice. The most successful lobbyist is going to be a person whose ideas get internalized by a large number of legislators, so that those legislators actually think that they're doing what they want to do. And maybe they are, right? When we internalize voices, it's not always that we're just being manipulated and treated like puppets. It may be that the reason why certain voices are easier to internalize is because that perspective makes more sense to us, right? The reason why my wife's voice is the most often in my head is not just because of clock time and just because of all the connections we have. It's that we're aligned in terms of values and perspectives, and I can easily internalize her voice because it lands well. And so lobbyists, even with greater access, they're going to have an easier time getting their perspective sunk into the perspective of legislators who already are inclined to move in that direction. It doesn't mean that lobbyists don't go to work on people who don't see eye to eye with them, right? If you are a lobbyist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it doesn't mean you're not going to talk to Democrats. Just because Democrats are going to be a harder sell than Republicans for the messaging and the ideas and the policies that you're pushing for. Of course you're going to talk to Democrats. They're going to internalize your ideas less, but the more you can do it, the more access you have to them, the more likely that some of your messaging is going to get through. And that you're going to soften. If you don't necessarily come over to their side, softening your opposition to what they want is a success for a lobbyist, right? It doesn't always have to translate into a yes vote or a no vote. It could be a softening of your position. It could be okay, that amendment, I don't hate that amendment so much. So I'll support that amendment. I'm not gonna vote for everything you want, and I'm gonna work to take certain things out of this bill that don't seem to fit with what I think is the right solution. But yeah, I'm softened up to the idea of not raising corporate taxes all the way back up to 35%. I think we need to raise them, but I see the perspective. That is in those margins of persuasion is where lobbyists really are doing their work. They're not just shoving cash across and saying, give me a yes vote on these bills or on these amendments. That's a huge caricature. One of the ways that lobbyists are successful is with information. Again, legislators are busy people with only a limited amount of time, and while they have staff to do a lot of work for them, they also have a limited number of staff. Lobbyists bring information. They bring white papers. They bring outside research. They bring industry experts who to either to testify or to add information to their reports. They bring a legislator information because what legislators are doing constantly is making decisions about votes, about amendments, about the kind of bills they want to write, about the policies that they even want to discuss and pay attention to, the things they want to prioritize. When you get information from somebody that's useful in you achieving your agenda, in doing your job, that information is going to be very influential. You're going to look at this report and say, oh, here's a bunch of information that aligns in the direction of this. It's like, theoretically, I thought that raising the corporate tax rate wasn't going to be that big of a deal because corporations ought to pay more of their money. Here's a report that shows that for each percentage increase in the corporate tax rate, it's going to cost that many jobs, right? Now, maybe you want to balance fairness of the tax code with loss of jobs, and so you're not necessarily going to just do the bidding of that lobbyist, but that again softens it up. Information research has a tremendous impact. Also, information that helps with the constituent connection. You might not have known that this particular policy was going to hurt or benefit a bunch of people in your district, and the lobbyist says, look, here it is. And also, one of the things that lobbyists do is they bring talking points, they bring messaging strategy as part of their information to be able to say, look, you think that if you vote yes for this bill, it's going to kill you back home. But here's a way to frame it. Here's some polling we've done that shows, or some focus grouping that we've done that shows actually that if you talk about this issue in this particular way, it's going to mute criticism, it's going to mute opposition, or you're going to be able to turn something that you thought was a tough vote into actually beneficial for your re-election campaign. So the information that lobbyists can bring to you is research and also messaging strategy and research that backs that, such as polling and focus grouping, and just, here's a great slogan. Here, if you talk about this issue in this particular way, right? Don't call it an estate tax, call it the death tax. Or don't call it the death tax, call it the estate tax, depending on which side of that particular debate you're on. Now, in that particular example, most people in Congress are going to know whether they want to call it the death tax or the estate tax, because that's a pretty simple one. But there's professional PR work that lobbyists can bring, essentially PR strategy to legislators. And that's extremely important for re-election, right? Because re-election is not just about raising a bunch of money and getting a bunch of endorsements, it's also about messaging yourself in a beneficial way that will win you the most votes. That's what lobbyists can do. And of course, they can tell you when there's a constituent connection, how much, and then of course, how to message that to your constituents so that they are pleased with you rather than displeased with you. Okay, let me move on to money and do this really quickly because I've already said a lot about money both in this lecture as well as in previous lectures and in a lot of the optional ones. Just to note the different sources of money, right? Political action committees. Now, political action committees are an outside influence because there are literally thousands of political action committees outside of Congress. There are also political action committees that are assembled by members of Congress and also by members of of parties, by people who aren't necessarily in Congress but who are supporting people who are in Congress. Those, I've talked about the leadership PACs in the previous lecture as a way of getting to a leadership position. There are also all kinds of party committees that are dedicated to raising money and distributing that money to candidates. So for example, there's the National Republican Senate Campaign Committee headed by Rick Scott. The job of that committee is to raise a lot of money so they can donate money to Republican Senate candidates so they can retain, so they can get the majority back in the next election cycle. That's one of numerous examples of committees, political action committees inside of Congress that are doing their work. And obviously, whether the political action committee is inside or outside of Congress itself, is a party arm or is a political action committee that is put together by a labor union or by a corporation or by an interest group or an advocacy group, that money is going to be helpful, as all money is helpful. Bundlers are individuals who go out and they seek all of those small dollar donors, or the ones who are maxed out at their contributions, and bring them to you together. And literally, it used to be like a bundle of checks with a rubber band over it, right? It doesn't work that viscerally anymore, but that's what a bundler is. A bundler is a person who is telling you that I can raise a lot of money for you, and when someone hands you like either a literal or virtual stack of checks with a rubber band around it, you're going to talk to that person. You're going to golf with that person. You're going to listen to their perspective. You're going to be, much like lobbyists can get in your head, you're going to be likely to internalize their perspective. Now, it doesn't work that they give you a bundle of cash or checks and say, well, here's what these checks are for. It's that I'm bringing you a bunch of money that represents these viewpoints. Here are these viewpoints, and you probably ought to consider aligning your votes and your legislative behavior behind these viewpoints. Wealthy individuals obviously can do this as well, though I put these two things together. Wealthy individuals and outside money are actually, what's interesting about them is they don't have the same kind of direct influence over elected officials as other forms of money. Not just because they're prevented from coordinating with campaigns on their messaging, but because when somebody spends, or an organization spends $1 million on helping you get reelected, not by helping you raise $1 million, but by actually just spending it as outside money, you don't necessarily need to listen to them, right? They're spending that money because they're investing it in your reelection because they think that you're going to vote the way that they want you to vote. But the fear of losing the support of wealthy individuals and losing the support of outside money, that is actually another form of soft power, right? Sheldon Adelson doesn't have to call you up and say, hey, if you vote for these things, I'm not going to donate or spend a bunch of money on your campaign. You don't even need to hear that. You just know, like, oh my God, if I vote for this tax increase, I'm going to, all that outside money that helped me get elected in the first place, it's going to evaporate. There's that fear of that. And so you're going to essentially listen to this shadow lobbyist who doesn't actually call your office or sit in your office or go golfing with you or take you out to lunch. It's a shadow lobbyist in the sense that you hear that voice yourself because of your fear of the loss of that outside money. Or it's a shadow lobbyist because you see the possibility for generating a lot of outside money if you behave in a particular kind of way. And this is the way that outside money does have an influence over the legislative process that is non-traditional, right? It doesn't flow through the lobbyist conduit. It flows through this sort of shadow lobbyist where you're listening to the voice in your own head and you're making up that voice. You know what they want. You know what they want. They don't even have to call you up and tell you. You know what they want. And so if you don't want to lose their money or if you want to gain their money, then you're going to do what you pretty sure that they want you to do. Private sector jobs is I would say it's an influence, but it's kind of the most remote. Most members of Congress are eventually going to leave Congress at some point after many years of service, and some of them actually more increasingly after fewer years of service, but after some years of service, they're a very valuable commodity in the private sector, either as a consultant or as a lobbyist because they have connections and they know how the system works, or as member of boards of directors to steer companies through the legislative environment. There are lots and lots of lucrative private sector jobs, and you're not going to get those if you have worked against certain interests. Now, I say that this is a kind of a remote interest because basically no matter what you do in Congress, you're going to be able to find a private sector job that's lucrative after you leave. Maybe you would love that job to be with the healthcare industry because that's the sector of society that you care about. That's where you've done your policy work. But if you're like, well, if I work against the interests of the big interests in the healthcare industry, I'm not going to get those jobs. That might be true, right? So you might not be able to get your favorite soft landing in the best place possible that you want if you don't do the bidding of those big interests. But you're going to be able to get a job with a lobbying firm on K Street. You're going to be able to get a job as a political consultant. At worst, you're going to be able to get on the board of a think tank or an important position on a think tank. And so it's not as though you're like, damn, if I don't do big pharma's bidding, I'm never going to get a job in healthcare in the private sector after I leave Congress. I'm never going to get a big lucrative position. Yeah, maybe you won't, but this is where it's like, okay, people aren't going to just sell their souls to big pharma just so they can then get on the board of a company in healthcare because they like healthcare. That's not how human beings work, especially when you can not sell your soul to big pharma and still know that you're going to get a lucrative consulting job or lobbying job or think tank job when you leave Congress. So that's there, but it's deep far in the back of the mind, and it doesn't really do any interest groups a lot of good to have the fact that members of Congress are ultimately going to leave Congress and become and look to the private sector for jobs. That kind of thinking has a bigger influence over executive policymakers, and that's a subject for a totally different class than this one. And this lecture is now running long, and so I'm not even going to gesture at that, or I'm just going to only gesture at that and not even talk about it at all, and just say that here it is, that this is the major outside influences that form the thoughts and nudge the behavior of members of Congress towards or against certain kinds of votes, yes or no, towards or against certain kinds of amendments in policy language in particular bills. All right, that's the end of Module 2.